Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that feels completely normal. So normal that most people never question it. The quiet discomfort that appears when you are alone for too long. Not immediate fear. Not panic. Just a subtle shift. A feeling that something is slightly off. That something is missing. That perhaps you should be doing something. Or finding someone. Or at the very least, turning on a light or a sound to fill the space. Before you settle in, take a moment. Like the video, subscribe if you genuinely enjoy this kind of slow descent into human behavior. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. There is something quietly fascinating about people all over the world choosing not to be alone, together. Now dim the lights. Get comfortable. And let's slowly move backward. Long before cities, before language settled into anything recognizable, before humans had names for emotions they barely understood. Being alone was not a lifestyle. It was a problem. Not a dramatic one. Not immediately fatal every time. But a problem in the same quiet way that a small crack in a shelter becomes dangerous when the weather changes. Early humans did not fear loneliness in the way we describe it now. They didn't sit and reflect on their emotional state. They weren't journaling about isolation or wondering if they needed better boundaries. They simply understood something much simpler. Alone meant exposed. And exposed meant unpredictable. In the deep prehistoric past, survival was not about strength alone. It was about awareness. Awareness of movement in the grass. Awareness of sound in the distance. Awareness of patterns that, if ignored, tended to end badly. One pair of eyes was useful. Several pairs of eyes were better. A single human could miss something. A group was harder to surprise. This wasn't philosophy. It was pattern recognition reinforced by consequences. Imagine standing in an open landscape. No buildings. No walls. No locked doors. No clear boundary between safety and danger. Now imagine hearing something you cannot see. If you are alone, that sound expands in importance. It could be nothing. Or it could be something that ends your day very quickly. There is no one to confirm your interpretation. No one to say, it's fine. No one to share the responsibility of being wrong. So your brain does what brains tend to do when uncertainty increases. It assumes the worst. Not out of pessimism. Out of efficiency. Now place that same human in a group. The sound still exists. But now it is divided. Attention is shared. Responsibility is shared. Reaction is shared. Someone else hears it. Someone else responds. Someone else might already be moving before you even decide what it means. The burden of interpretation decreases. And with it, the tension. This is where something subtle begins. Not fear of being alone as an idea. But preference. A quiet, practical preference for not handling uncertainty by yourself. No one sat down and made a rule. No one declared that humans must stay together. It simply worked better. And humans tend to repeat what works better without asking too many questions about why. At this stage, being alone wasn't forbidden. It just wasn't efficient. If someone wandered too far, they might return. Or they might not. Either outcome taught the group something. And groups are very good at learning from outcomes, even when they don't fully understand them. Over time, a pattern forms. Stay close. Move together. Sleep near others. Not because it feels emotionally comforting. But because it reduces variables. And in a world full of variables, reduction is survival. But something else begins happening at the same time. Something quieter. Something internal. The human brain, always looking to optimize, starts connecting presence with safety. Not consciously. Not with words. Just through repetition. Every time nothing bad happens while others are nearby, a small association forms. Every time something goes wrong while someone is alone, a stronger association forms. The brain does not wait for statistical perfection. It builds rules from patterns that are good enough. And those rules begin to feel like instinct. At first, this instinct is simple. Stay near others when possible. But instincts rarely stay simple. They evolve. They layer. They expand into areas they were never originally meant to cover. Because the brain does not separate physical safety from emotional experience very cleanly. If something keeps you alive long enough, it starts to feel important in ways that go beyond survival. Now imagine a child growing up in this environment. They do not receive instructions. They receive exposure. They see adults staying together. They see movement happening as a group. They notice that when people disappear, it becomes a problem. No one explains this. No one needs to. Children copy patterns that appear to work. And being near others clearly works. So they stay near others. Not because they understand danger. But because separation feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things tend to create discomfort long before they create understanding. This is important. Because discomfort is faster than logic. Always. A child does not need to know why being alone is risky. They only need to feel that it is. And once that feeling exists, behavior follows. Over generations, this pattern deepens. The preference for proximity becomes expectation. The expectation becomes default. And the default begins to feel like necessity. Now something interesting happens. Being alone doesn't just feel inefficient. It starts to feel wrong. Not morally wrong. Not socially wrong. Just, off. And that feeling is difficult to explain. Because it doesn't come from reasoning. It comes from absence. The absence of something the brain has quietly labeled as stabilizing. This is the beginning of a shift. From practical grouping to psychological dependence. At this point in history, humans are not afraid of loneliness in the modern sense. But the foundation has been built. The brain has learned that others reduce uncertainty. And reducing uncertainty feels good. Now remove that reduction. You are alone again. The environment hasn't changed. The world is just as unpredictable as before. But now your brain notices something else. There is no one else here. And suddenly, the space feels larger. The silence feels heavier. The same environment carries more weight. Nothing has actually become more dangerous. But it feels like it has. And that feeling is enough. Because humans do not respond to reality alone. They respond to perceived reality. And perceived reality is shaped by patterns the brain trusts. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Being with others feels stable. Being alone feels unstable. So humans seek stability. Which reinforces the presence of others. Which strengthens the association. And slowly, very slowly, a preference becomes a need. Not a conscious need. Not one anyone would describe clearly. Just a quiet pull. Toward voices. Toward movement. Toward presence. And away from silence. But silence itself is not the problem. Silence is just the environment where the brain has nothing external to anchor to. No signals. No reactions. No confirmation. So the brain turns inward. And inward is rarely quiet. Thoughts begin to fill the space. Not organized thoughts. Not useful ones. Just, activity. Fragments. Memories. Possibilities. Questions with no clear answers. And without distraction, those thoughts grow louder. Now imagine experiencing that for the first time. Not in a modern room. Not with the option to pick up a phone or turn on music. But in a world where silence means exposure. The mind does what it has always done. It prepares. It scans for danger. Even when none is visible. It replays scenarios. Even when they are unlikely. It creates possibilities. Even when they are unnecessary. This is not anxiety as we define it today. This is early pattern extension. The brain is trying to solve a problem. The problem is that it has no external input. So it creates its own. And that internal noise becomes associated with being alone. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Just gradually. Alone becomes louder. Together becomes quieter. And humans, being very consistent in their preferences, begin choosing the quieter option. Not because it is better. But because it is easier. And this is how something subtle begins to take shape. Not fear. Not yet. Just avoidance. Avoidance of extended silence. Avoidance of isolation. Avoidance of environments where the brain has to generate its own stimulation. And avoidance, repeated enough times, becomes fear. Not because the thing itself is dangerous. But because it has been consistently avoided long enough to feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things always feel bigger than they are. Avoidance does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a clear statement or a dramatic realization. It builds quietly. One small decision at a time. Stay a little closer. Wait a little longer before leaving. Find a reason to remain where others are. None of these feel significant on their own. They feel practical. Reasonable. Even invisible. But repetition has a way of turning invisible things into permanent ones. As early humans spent more time in groups, something began to change, not in the environment, but in expectation. Presence was no longer just helpful. It became assumed. And assumptions are powerful. Because once something is assumed, its absence stands out immediately. At first, being alone was simply a variation of normal. Now, it starts to feel like a deviation. Not a dangerous one. Not yet. Just, unusual. And unusual things demand attention. Imagine sitting by a fire with others. There is movement. Sound. Small, constant signals that everything is functioning as expected. Even silence, in a group, is not truly silent. There are shifts. Breathing. The quiet reassurance that something else is there. Now remove all of it. No movement. No shared rhythm. No external confirmation that the world is continuing as it should. The brain notices immediately. Not because it prefers noise. But because it prefers feedback. And feedback disappears when you are alone. So the brain begins compensating. It increases sensitivity. Sounds seem sharper. Shadows feel more defined. Time stretches slightly, as if waiting for something to happen. This is not fear yet. It is preparation. But preparation, without resolution, becomes tension. And tension, held long enough, becomes discomfort. At this stage, humans begin doing something subtle but important. They start returning to others more quickly. Not because they consciously decide to. But because staying alone feels like work. Being alone requires constant internal monitoring. Constant interpretation. Constant readiness for something that may or may not occur. Being with others distributes that workload. And the brain, always interested in efficiency, notices the difference. Over time, this creates another quiet association. Alone equals effort. Together equals ease. And humans, without exception, drift toward ease whenever possible. This is where something deeper begins to form. The brain starts predicting absence. Not just reacting to being alone. But anticipating it. And anticipation changes everything. Now, before someone even becomes alone, the brain begins preparing for it. A slight resistance appears. A hesitation. A subtle question. Do I need to go? Should I stay a little longer? This is not fear. It is pre-discomfort. The brain has learned that being alone requires more energy. So it tries to avoid entering that state in the first place. And when avoidance happens before experience, the experience itself becomes unfamiliar. This is how the gap forms. Humans spend more time together. Less time alone. The brain becomes more accustomed to shared environments. Less practiced at handling solitude. And anything we practice less feels harder when we return to it. Not because it has changed, but because we have. Now, imagine generations passing like this. Children growing up surrounded by constant presence. Learning from observation. Copying behavior. Absorbing patterns without questioning them. They are rarely alone. Not for long. Not without reason. So when they are alone, the experience feels new. Not completely new, but unfamiliar enough to trigger attention. And attention, when focused inward, amplifies everything. A small sound becomes significant. A passing thought becomes important. A moment of stillness becomes noticeable. The brain begins filling the gaps again. But now, something has changed. The thoughts are no longer just practical. They begin to drift. What if something happens? What if no one is nearby? What if I missed something? These are not logical concerns. They are echoes of earlier survival patterns. But without immediate danger to resolve them. They remain unanswered. And unanswered questions tend to grow. Not in size, but in presence. They linger. They repeat. They loop. This is where the experience of being alone begins to shift from neutral to active. Something is happening now. Not outside, but inside. And humans are not naturally comfortable with internal noise. External problems can be solved. Internal ones are less cooperative. So the brain looks for a solution. And the simplest solution is familiar. Return to others. Presence quiets the noise. Not because the thoughts disappear, but because attention shifts. Conversation interrupts. Movement distracts. Shared focus redirects. And suddenly, the internal world becomes quieter again. This reinforces the pattern. Alone equals noise. Together equals calm. And the brain, keeping track of outcomes, updates its preferences accordingly. Now something subtle becomes stronger. Humans begin seeking presence not just for safety, but for relief. Relief from their own thoughts. And this is an important turning point. Because once something provides relief, it becomes valuable beyond its original purpose. Being with others is no longer just practical. It is soothing. And anything that soothes is repeated. Over time, this repetition deepens. Humans start organizing their behavior around shared presence. Sleeping together. Eating together. Working together. Resting together. Not just because it works, but because it feels better. And feelings, once involved, accelerate everything. Now remove that structure again. A human sits alone. No immediate danger. No urgent task. No external demand. Just space. And time. The brain, now accustomed to constant input, reacts differently. It doesn't simply observe. It searches for something to engage with. Something to process. Something to stabilize attention. When nothing appears, it creates. Thoughts become more detailed. More persistent. Less controlled. Memories surface without invitation. Future scenarios begin forming without direction. The mind fills the silence with activity. And without external interruption. That activity continues. This is where discomfort sharpens. Not because the thoughts are dangerous. But because they are unregulated. There is no external anchor to reset them. No interruption to break the cycle. So they continue. And the longer they continue, the more noticeable they become. At this point, being alone is no longer just quiet. It is active. And humans begin developing a preference against that activity. Not consciously. Not deliberately. Just consistently. Shorter periods of solitude. More frequent returns to others. Less tolerance for extended isolation. And slowly. Very slowly. The unfamiliar becomes uncomfortable. The uncomfortable becomes undesirable. And the undesirable becomes something to avoid. Not with urgency. Not with panic. Just with quiet consistency. And that is how something begins to take shape again. Still not fear. But closer now. Because the brain has learned something important. When left alone, it has to deal with itself. And that, more than anything in the external world, is what begins to feel uncertain. Dealing with the outside world is difficult. But it has structure. There are objects. Movements. Events that begin and end. Even danger, when it appears, is clear in one important way. It is visible. You can run from it. Hide from it. Fight it, if necessary. But the internal world does not behave like that. It has no clear boundaries. No defined beginning or end. No obvious way to escape once it starts moving. And early humans, for a very long time, did not have language to organize that experience. They could feel. They could react. But they could not explain to themselves what was happening. So when thoughts appeared without warning, when emotions shifted without clear cause, when the mind became active in the absence of external input, it was not labeled. It was experienced. And experience, without explanation, tends to feel larger than it is. Now place that experience inside solitude. No distractions. No interruptions. No shared attention. Just a human mind, becoming aware of itself. At first, this awareness is brief. Moments of stillness. Short periods where nothing external demands attention. But as humans grow more capable, as tools improve, as survival becomes slightly more stable, those moments begin to stretch. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. There is time now. Time where nothing urgent is happening. And time, when left unstructured, creates space. Space for thought. This is where something begins to shift again. The mind is no longer reacting constantly. It begins observing. Not the world. But itself. Thoughts about thoughts. Reactions to reactions. A strange loop forming quietly in the background. And without guidance. Without language to shape it. This loop becomes unpredictable. One thought leads to another. That thought leads somewhere else. Soon, the original starting point is gone. The mind moves. Not toward a goal. But simply because it can. This is not a problem in itself. In many ways, it is the beginning of imagination. But imagination, without boundaries, does not always stay neutral. It explores possibilities. Some useful. Some unnecessary. Some unsettling. What if something happens? What if something is nearby? What if something has already gone wrong and I have not noticed? These thoughts are not chosen. They appear. And when they appear in solitude, They are uninterrupted. There is no external correction. No one to say it is unlikely. No one to redirect attention. So the thought continues. Not because it is true, but because nothing stops it. This is how the mind begins creating its own environment. And that environment is not always calm. Now imagine experiencing this repeatedly. Periods of solitude. Moments of internal noise. Return to others. Relief. The pattern becomes familiar. Alone equals internal activity. Together equals external focus. And humans begin preferring the state that requires less internal management. Not because they are avoiding themselves deliberately, but because managing the self is complex. And complexity, without tools to handle it, feels like pressure. Over time, this pressure gains a certain quality. It becomes noticeable before it even fully forms. A person begins to sense it coming. The moment before solitude. The moment before silence settles in. There is a slight shift. A quiet resistance. Stay a little longer. Find something to do. Delay the moment. Again, not fear, but anticipation of discomfort. And anticipation shapes behavior very efficiently. Now, something else begins to layer on top of this. Memory. Not just immediate memory, but emotional memory. The brain does not simply record events. It records how those events felt. So every time solitude led to discomfort, even mild discomfort, that feeling is stored. Not in detail. Not as a clear narrative. But as an association. Alone feels like this. And the next time solitude approaches, that stored feeling returns slightly ahead of time. Preparing the system. But preparation, when repeated often enough, becomes expectation. And expectation makes the experience stronger. Now solitude is not just experienced. It is anticipated. And anticipation amplifies everything. A small discomfort becomes more noticeable. A passing thought feels more significant. A quiet moment carries more weight than it used to. Because the brain is already watching for it. Now something important happens. Humans begin developing ways to interrupt this process. Not intentionally. Not as a strategy. Just naturally. They create noise. Small sounds. Movements. Rhythms. Anything that provides external input. Fire crackling. Stone tapping. Voices, even when saying very little. These things do not remove solitude completely. But they soften it. They give the brain something to hold on to. Something outside itself. And that makes a difference. Because attention, once anchored externally, does not spiral inward as easily. So humans begin surrounding themselves with subtle forms of stimulation. Not entertainment. Not distraction in the modern sense. Just enough activity to prevent the mind from turning fully inward. And over time, this becomes another pattern. Silence feels heavier. Noise feels lighter. Not because silence is harmful, but because it removes the external anchors the brain has learned to rely on. Now remove those anchors again. True solitude. True silence. The mind becomes louder, faster. More active. More unpredictable. And without practice handling that state, it feels overwhelming more quickly. Not dramatically, but noticeably. And humans, again, respond in the same way they always have. They reduce exposure. Shorter periods of solitude. More consistent presence of others. More reliance on shared environments. And slowly, very slowly, tolerance decreases. Not because the experience has changed, but because familiarity has. The less time spent alone, the less comfortable it feels. the less comfortable it feels. The more it is avoided. And the more it is avoided, the more unfamiliar it becomes. The loop closes. At this point, something new begins to form. Not just avoidance. Not just discomfort. But meaning. Humans start interpreting the feeling. Not just experiencing it. And interpretation changes everything. Because once a feeling has meaning, it can grow beyond its original cause. Solitude is no longer just a condition. It becomes something to explain. Something to define. Something that feels like it says something about the person experiencing it. And that is where things begin to shift more quickly. Because once a feeling becomes personal, it becomes harder to ignore. And much harder to sit with. Once a feeling becomes personal, it stops being just a reaction. It becomes a reflection. Not of the world, but of the self. And humans, for all their ability to survive harsh environments, have always been less comfortable dealing with themselves directly. Up until now, solitude created activity. Thoughts. Memories. Possibilities. But now, something deeper begins to emerge. Evaluation. Not just thinking, but judging those thoughts. Is this normal? Why am I thinking this? Should I feel this way? These questions do not arrive fully formed. They develop slowly. At first, it is just a subtle awareness. A sense that the mind is doing something unexpected. Then, over time, that awareness sharpens. The human brain begins watching itself. And this is where solitude becomes more complicated than it was ever meant to be. Because now, being alone is not just about handling internal noise. It is about interpreting it. And interpretation, especially without guidance, rarely stays neutral. Imagine sitting alone again. No external distractions. No one else present. The mind begins moving, as it always does. A thought appears. But now, instead of passing quietly, it is noticed. And once it is noticed, it is examined. Why did that thought appear? What does it mean? Does it say something about me? The thought itself was small. But the attention given to it makes it larger. And attention, once focused inward, tends to stay there. This creates a new kind of loop. Not just thought leading to thought, but thought leading to interpretation. Leading to more thought. And without interruption, this loop becomes dense. Not necessarily negative, but heavy. Because the mind is now carrying both the experience and the analysis of that experience. This is where solitude begins to feel like pressure. Not from the outside, but from within. Now imagine this happening repeatedly. Periods of being alone. Moments of internal activity. Moments of self-awareness. Moments of evaluation. And then, return to others. Something interesting happens. The evaluation stops. Not completely, but significantly. Because attention shifts outward again. Conversation replaces reflection. Movement replaces stillness. Shared focus replaces self-focus. And with that shift, relief appears. Not dramatic relief. Not noticeable at first. Just a quiet easing. The pressure fades. The thoughts slow down. The mind settles into something simpler. And once again, the brain notices. Alone equals complexity. Together equals simplicity. And the preference strengthens. Now something subtle becomes more permanent. Humans begin associating others not just with safety, but with identity stability. When you are around others, your role is clearer. Your behavior has structure. Your responses have context. You are not just existing. You are interacting. And interaction provides boundaries. Boundaries for thought. Boundaries for behavior. Boundaries for identity. But in solitude, those boundaries loosen. There is no one to respond to. No one to reflect you back to yourself. No one to confirm that you are acting as expected. So the mind expands into that space. And expansion, while powerful, is not always comfortable. Because without boundaries, everything becomes possible. Every version of yourself. Every thought. Every doubt. Every question. And humans, despite their curiosity, do not always enjoy unlimited possibility when it is directed inward. It feels unstable. Not dangerous in a physical sense, but uncertain in a psychological one. Now something important begins to take shape. Humans start using others as anchors. Not consciously. Not deliberately. Just naturally. Other people provide feedback. You say something. They respond. You act. They react. This loop creates a sense of continuity. A sense that you are consistent. Recognizable. Stable. But in solitude, that loop disappears. There is no immediate feedback. No correction. No confirmation. So the mind begins generating its own feedback. And self-generated feedback is rarely as steady as external feedback. It shifts. It questions itself. It contradicts. This creates another layer of discomfort. Not just internal noise, but internal inconsistency. And inconsistency feels unstable. So humans begin preferring environments where their sense of self feels more fixed. Where reactions are predictable. Where behavior fits into a shared structure. Where identity feels less fluid. And that environment is other people. Now solitude carries something new. Not just silence. Not just internal activity. But uncertainty about the self. And that uncertainty is subtle. It does not appear as a clear fear. It appears as a feeling that something is not quite settled. That something is shifting slightly beneath the surface. And without practice navigating that feeling, it becomes something to avoid. Not dramatically. Not consciously. Just consistently. Shorter periods alone. More reliance on shared environments. More engagement with others. And over time, less familiarity with the self in isolation. Now, when solitude appears, it feels heavier than before. Not because it has changed, but because the person experiencing it has less experience handling it. And unfamiliar internal states tend to feel more intense. Even when they are not. At this stage, something important locks in. Humans are no longer just avoiding discomfort. They are avoiding uncertainty about themselves. And that is far more powerful. Because external discomfort can be managed. Avoided. Solved. Internal uncertainty requires engagement. And engagement, without tools, feels like risk. So instead of engaging, humans do something else. They stay connected. Not constantly. Not perfectly. But enough to keep that uncertainty from becoming too visible. And that is how solitude begins to change again. From discomfort to something slightly more serious. Something that carries weight before it even begins. Something that is no longer just avoided, but quietly resisted. Still not full fear, but very close now. Because the brain has learned something deeper. Being alone does not just expose the environment. It exposes the self. And the self is not always predictable. When the self becomes unpredictable, the problem is no longer external. It becomes internal management. And internal management is not something early humans were designed to do for long periods of time. They were designed to react. To move. To respond to immediate conditions. Not to sit still and observe the full range of their own thoughts without interruption. So when that situation begins to occur more often, the brain looks for ways to reduce it. Not eliminate it. Just reduce it enough to stay comfortable. And this is where something very familiar begins to take shape. Distraction. Not the modern kind. Not entertainment or constant stimulation. Just simple, repeated engagement with the external world. Handling objects. Repeating tasks. Maintaining movement. Staying near activity. Anything that keeps attention outward. Because outward attention stabilizes the system. It gives the mind structure. Direction. Limits. Without those limits, the mind expands again. And expansion, as we've seen, is not always comfortable. Now imagine a human who has spent most of their time surrounded by others. Most of their actions are shared. Most of their experiences are observed. Most of their behavior is shaped by interaction. Then suddenly, they are alone. No one watching. No one responding. No one confirming anything. The first thing that disappears is structure. Not physical structure, but behavioral structure. There is no immediate reason to act. No expectation to meet. No reaction required. So the mind begins filling that gap. What should I be doing? Is this the right thing to do? Does this even matter? These questions do not have clear answers in solitude. Because answers usually come from interaction. Without interaction, the questions remain open. And open questions create tension. Not urgent tension, but persistent. Now layer something else on top of this. Time. When humans are engaged with others, time moves differently. It is divided. Segmented. Filled with events. But in solitude, time stretches. Not because it actually changes, but because there are fewer markers to divide it. Moments blend together. Gaps become noticeable. Waiting becomes visible. And when waiting becomes visible, the mind notices it. Why is nothing happening? Should something be happening? Am I missing something? Again, not logical questions. Just natural responses to unstructured time. Now combine unstructured time with internal activity. Thoughts filling the gaps. Questions without answers. Attention turning inward. The experience becomes heavier. Not overwhelming, but dense. And density, when sustained, becomes tiring. This is important. Solitude is not just uncomfortable. It is effortful. It requires managing thoughts. Managing time. Managing attention. And humans, again, tend to avoid sustained effort when easier options exist. So they return to others. Where time is structured. Attention is guided. Behavior is defined. And each return reinforces the same pattern. Alone equals effort. Together equals ease. Now something begins to solidify. Humans are not just choosing to be with others. They are depending on it. Not for survival in the original sense, but for regulation. Regulation of thought. Regulation of emotion. Regulation of identity. And once something becomes a regulator, it becomes difficult to remove. Because removing it reveals everything it was quietly managing. Now remove it again. A human sits alone. The silence arrives. The space expands. The mind activates. But now, something else appears almost immediately. Awareness of the process. I am alone. This is uncomfortable. This feels different. And that awareness accelerates everything. Because now the person is not just experiencing solitude. They are noticing themselves experiencing it. This creates another loop. Experience. Awareness of experience. Reaction to awareness. And each layer adds weight. At this point, something important changes. Solitude is no longer neutral. It is interpreted. An interpretation begins shaping emotion more directly. This feels uncomfortable. This feels strange. This feels wrong. These are not objective truths. But the brain does not require objectivity to form conclusions. It requires repetition. And once a conclusion begins forming, it influences future experiences. Now, before solitude even fully begins, there is a subtle expectation. This might not feel good. And expectation amplifies experience. So the discomfort arrives faster. Feels stronger. Lasts longer. Not because solitude itself has changed, but because the brain has assigned meaning to it. Now something else happens. Humans begin explaining the feeling. Not scientifically. Not accurately. Just in ways that make sense to them. I don't like being alone. Something feels off. I feel better around others. Simple statements. But behind them is a complex structure of learned patterns, associations, and internal processes. And once these explanations exist, they begin guiding behavior more directly. Not just instinctively, but consciously. A person chooses to avoid being alone. Not just because it feels uncomfortable, but because they believe it is better not to be. This is a subtle but powerful shift. Because belief reinforces behavior. And behavior reinforces belief. Now the loop is complete. Less time alone. Less familiarity with solitude. More discomfort when it occurs. Stronger belief that it should be avoided. And slowly, very slowly, something that began as a practical preference becomes something else entirely. Something closer to fear. Not fear in the dramatic sense, but a quiet resistance. A reluctance. A steady movement away from isolation whenever possible. At this stage, humans are not afraid of being alone in the way we describe it today. But they are no longer comfortable with it. And once comfort disappears, fear does not need much time to take its place. Because fear does not require danger. It only requires uncertainty. Repeated often enough to feel real. And solitude, by now, carries plenty of that. By now, nothing dramatic has happened. No single moment where humans suddenly became afraid of being alone. No event. No decision. No clear turning point. Just a series of small adjustments. Repeated often enough to feel permanent. Solitude has changed. Not in its nature, but in its meaning. It began as a neutral state. Then it became inefficient. Then uncomfortable. Then effortful. Then something to avoid. And now, it begins to feel like something to escape. Not urgently. Not always. But consistently enough that the pattern holds. At this stage, something else begins to layer into the experience. Comparison. Humans are not just experiencing solitude. They are comparing it to something else. Togetherness. And comparison sharpens perception. Being alone is not just quiet. It is quieter than being with others. Not having interaction is not just neutral. It is less engaging than shared experience. And once comparison exists, preference becomes clearer. Together feels fuller. Alone feels emptier. Not objectively, but relatively. And humans respond strongly to relative differences. Now something subtle happens. Solitude starts to feel like a lack. Not just a state, but an absence of something expected. An absence, when noticed repeatedly, begins to feel like something is missing. What is missing? Not always clear. Sometimes it is noise. Sometimes it is movement. Sometimes it is simply the presence of another mind nearby. But whatever it is, the brain registers that it is gone. And once something is perceived as missing, the natural response is to restore it. So humans begin seeking presence more actively. Not just drifting toward others, but moving with intention. Finding reasons to be near people. Creating opportunities for interaction. Maintaining proximity even when it is not strictly necessary. Because restoring presence restores balance. And balance, once disturbed often enough, becomes something the brain prioritizes. Now something important changes again. Humans begin structuring their environments to reduce solitude. Not consciously at first. Just naturally. Sleeping in groups. Working in groups. Eating in groups. Resting in groups. Filling time with shared activity. Not because solitude is impossible, but because avoiding it feels easier. And ease, as always, guides behavior. Over time, this creates another shift. Solitude becomes less common. Not rare. But less frequent. Less extended. Less practiced. And anything that is practiced less feels more difficult when it returns. Now, when a person finds themselves alone, the experience feels sharper. Not because it has intensified, but because tolerance has decreased. And reduced tolerance makes everything feel stronger. This is where something begins to resemble fear more clearly. Not sudden fear. Not panic. But anticipation of discomfort strong enough to influence decisions. A person chooses not to be alone. Not just because they prefer company, but because solitude feels like something to manage. Something that requires effort. And humans, again, avoid unnecessary effort whenever possible. Now add one more layer. Uncertainty about duration. When you are with others, time has structure. You know when something begins. You know when it will likely end. But in solitude, time becomes less defined. How long will this last? What should I do during this time? When will something change? These questions do not always have answers. An unanswered duration creates a specific kind of discomfort. Not knowing when something will end makes it feel longer, even if it is not. So solitude begins to feel not just uncomfortable, but open-ended. And open-ended experiences are harder to tolerate. Because the brain prefers boundaries. A beginning. A middle. An end. Without those, it keeps scanning. Waiting for a signal that something has shifted. But in solitude, that signal does not always arrive. So the waiting continues. And waiting, without resolution, becomes tension. Now the experience has multiple layers. Internal activity. Self-awareness. Unstructured time. Lack of feedback. Perceived absence. Uncertain duration. None of these alone create fear. But together, they create something heavier. Something that the brain begins to treat as a state to avoid. Now imagine this repeating across generations. Children observing adults who rarely stay alone. Children growing up in environments filled with constant presence. Children learning, without instruction, that being alone is unusual. They do not question it. They absorb it. And when they experience solitude, it feels unfamiliar. Not dangerous, but different enough to trigger attention. And attention, again, amplifies everything. So the discomfort arrives faster. Feels stronger. Lasts longer. And the pattern continues. Less time alone. Less familiarity. More avoidance. Now something subtle locks in. Solitude is no longer just a condition. It becomes a signal. A signal that something is different. Something is missing. Something needs to be corrected. And once something becomes a signal, it triggers response. The response is simple. Find others. Create noise. Engage with something external. Restore the balance. Over time, this response becomes automatic. A person does not sit and think, "I should avoid being alone." They simply act in ways that prevent it. Filling time. Seeking interaction. Maintaining connection. And when those options are not available, the absence becomes more noticeable. More defined. And slowly, very slowly, the space of solitude becomes something the brain approaches cautiously. Not because it understands it fully, but because it has learned, through repetition, that it is not the easiest place to be. And humans, more than anything, tend to move toward ease. And away from what feels like work. Even when that work is simply sitting quietly with themselves. At this point, fear is no longer far away. Because fear does not require a clear threat. It only requires a state that feels difficult to handle. Repeated often enough. To become something the brain prefers to avoid. And solitude, by now, fits that pattern very well. By now, solitude has gathered weight. Not all at once. Not in any dramatic shift. But layer by layer. What was once neutral now carries expectation. Expectation of effort. Expectation of internal noise. Expectation of uncertainty. And expectation changes experience before it even begins. A person does not need to be alone to feel the effects of solitude anymore. They only need to know it is coming. That is enough. Now imagine the moment just before separation. Others begin to leave. The environment grows quieter. Movement slows. Nothing has fully changed yet. But something inside the mind adjusts. Attention sharpens. Thoughts begin forming slightly ahead of time. This might be uncomfortable. Not a statement. Not a clear sentence. Just a subtle shift in orientation. The brain preparing for a state it has learned requires management. And preparation, when repeated often enough, becomes tension. So now, even before solitude begins, there is resistance. Stay a little longer. Delay the moment. Find one more thing to do. Not out of fear, but out of preference for avoiding what comes next. And over time, that resistance strengthens. Now something else begins to change. Humans start shortening their exposure deliberately. They do not remain alone longer than necessary. If a task ends, they move on quickly. If silence appears, they interrupt it. If stillness stretches, they break it. Not consciously. Not with intention. Just automatically. And automation is where habits become deeply rooted. Now solitude is no longer something that simply happens. It is something that is consistently interrupted. And interruption prevents adaptation. Because adaptation requires time. Time to sit. Time to experience. Time to let the mind move without interference. But if solitude is always shortened, that process never completes. So the mind never fully adjusts. Which means every new experience of solitude feels slightly unfamiliar again. And unfamiliar experiences always feel stronger than familiar ones. This is how the cycle maintains itself. Avoidance reduces exposure. Reduced exposure prevents adaptation. Lack of adaptation increases discomfort. Discomfort reinforces avoidance. The loop is quiet, but extremely effective. Now something deeper begins to emerge. Association. Not just between solitude and discomfort, but between solitude and vulnerability. Not physical vulnerability in the original sense, but psychological vulnerability. Not physical vulnerability in the original sense, but psychological vulnerability. In solitude, there is nothing to hide behind. No conversation to steer attention away. No shared focus to diffuse awareness. Everything that appears in the mind is yours to deal with. And that creates a subtle sense of exposure. Not visible to others, but fully visible to yourself. And self-exposure is not something humans naturally seek, because it removes control. You cannot easily filter your thoughts. You cannot choose what appears. You cannot always guide where the mind goes. So being alone begins to feel like being seen by something you cannot step away from. Yourself. Now, this is not consciously understood. No one sits and thinks this in clear terms. But the feeling exists. A quiet sense that solitude reveals more than is comfortable. And once something reveals more than you expect, you approach it carefully. Or avoid it entirely. Now layer something else on top. Habituation to presence. Humans are now deeply used to constant interaction. Not necessarily meaningful interaction. Just presence. Voices. Movement. Shared space. These things create a baseline. A default environment the brain considers normal. And anything outside that baseline feels different. Solitude is now outside the baseline. Which means it triggers attention immediately. And attention, again, amplifies experience. So even mild discomfort feels more noticeable. Now imagine someone spending most of their time within this baseline. Surrounded by others. Engaged in shared activity. Rarely alone for extended periods. Then suddenly, they are alone. The shift is immediate. Not gradual. Because the contrast is strong. And contrast intensifies perception. Silence feels deeper. Time feels slower. Thoughts feel louder. Not because they are objectively stronger. But because they stand out more against the absence of everything else. And the brain, not distinguishing between intensity and contrast, reacts accordingly. This is where something begins to resemble fear more clearly. Not fear of something specific. But fear of the state itself. A hesitation to enter it. A desire to leave it quickly. A preference to avoid it when possible. Now something else begins to happen. Humans start filling solitude with substitutes. Not other people. But things that mimic presence. Sounds. Repetitive actions. Objects that require attention. Anything that reduces the intensity of being fully alone. Because full solitude, by now, is rarely experienced without interruption. And when it is, it feels stronger than it actually is. This creates another pattern. Solitude becomes something to manage. Not something to simply experience. And once something requires management, it begins to feel like a problem. Even if it is not. Now the brain updates again. This state is difficult. This state requires effort. This state should be minimized. And once that belief settles in, behavior follows automatically. Now humans do not just prefer being with others. They structure their lives around avoiding extended solitude. Not intentionally. Just naturally. Filling time. Maintaining connection. Creating constant engagement with something outside themselves. And when that engagement disappears, the absence is immediate. Noticeable. And often uncomfortable enough to prompt action. Now something important locks into place. Solitude is no longer neutral. It is something the brain approaches with caution. Something that feels heavier than other states. Something that carries expectation before it even begins. And expectation, as always, shapes reality. Now, when a person is alone, they are not just experiencing the moment. They are experiencing everything the brain has learned about that moment. All the associations. All the expectations. All the subtle resistance built over time. And that makes the experience feel stronger than it originally was. At this point, fear is no longer far away. Because fear does not require a clear threat. It only requires a state that feels difficult to control. Difficult to predict. And difficult to sit with for long periods of time. And solitude, after everything it has accumulated, has quietly become all three. By now, solitude is no longer just a condition. It has become an experience. Not a simple one. Not a neutral one. But something layered. Something that arrives with expectations already attached. And once expectations exist, they begin shaping behavior before reality has a chance to speak. A person does not wait to see how solitude feels. They already have an idea. This might be uncomfortable. This might feel long. This might feel heavy. And because the brain prefers confirmation over contradiction, it begins noticing anything that supports that expectation. A small moment of restlessness. A passing thought. A slight sense of unease. These become evidence. Not because they are significant, but because they align with what the brain predicted. And once evidence appears, the belief strengthens. Solitude feels like this. Now something else changes. Humans begin reacting to the feeling itself. Not just the state of being alone, but the experience of discomfort within it. They notice it. Focus on it. Try to reduce it. And this is where things begin to accelerate. Because attention amplifies experience. The more you notice something, the stronger it feels. So now, instead of solitude being a background condition, it becomes the center of attention. How do I feel right now? Why does this feel uncomfortable? How long will this last? These questions do not resolve the experience. They intensify it. Because they keep attention fixed on the very thing the brain is trying to move away from. Now the loop becomes tighter. Solitude creates internal activity. Internal activity creates awareness. Awareness creates attention. Attention amplifies discomfort. Discomfort reinforces avoidance. And avoidance prevents familiarity. Which keeps the experience feeling new. And anything that feels new feels stronger than it is. Now something subtle becomes more serious. Humans begin losing tolerance for stillness. Not just solitude. Stillness itself. Because stillness removes external anchors. No movement. No distraction. No shifting attention. Just presence. And presence, without structure, feels unstable. So even small moments of stillness begin to trigger activity. A need to move. To adjust. To engage with something. Not because something is wrong, but because doing nothing has become unfamiliar. Now layer something else into this. Control. Humans prefer environments they can influence. Predict. Shape. Being with others provides that. You can speak. Act. Respond. Adjust. There is interaction. But in solitude, control feels limited. You cannot easily control your thoughts. You cannot always guide your emotions. You cannot predict what will appear next. So the mind feels less stable. Not because it is unstable, but because it is less controlled. And lack of control often feels like risk. So solitude begins to carry another association. Not just discomfort, but loss of control. And humans respond strongly to that. They avoid situations where control feels uncertain. Even if those situations are not actually dangerous. Now something important happens. The brain stops treating solitude as neutral territory. It begins categorizing it. Not as a place of rest. Not as a place of neutrality. But as a place that requires management. And anything that requires management is approached with caution. Now imagine this fully developed. A person spends most of their time engaged. Connected. Surrounded by activity. Their baseline is full. Then suddenly, they are alone. The contrast is immediate. Not just quieter, but emptier. Not just slower, but more noticeable. And because their brain is used to constant input, the absence feels like something is missing. Even if nothing is actually wrong. Now the person reacts. Not dramatically. Just subtly. They reach for something. A task. A sound. A distraction. Anything to restore the baseline. And when that happens, the discomfort decreases. Which reinforces the behavior. Solitude leads to discomfort. Action reduces discomfort. So action becomes the response to solitude. And over time, the response becomes automatic. Now, something very important has happened. Solitude is no longer experienced directly. It is interrupted almost immediately. Which means the person never fully adapts to it. Which means it always feels slightly unfamiliar. Which keeps the discomfort alive. And anything that consistently produces discomfort, even mild discomfort, begins to resemble something the brain wants to avoid. Now we are very close. Because fear does not appear suddenly. It builds from repeated patterns of avoidance, expectation, and discomfort. And solitude, by now, has all three. Expectation of unease. Avoidance of the state. Discomfort when experienced. Now imagine one more layer. Interpretation of the discomfort itself. Not just feeling it, but assigning meaning to it. Why do I feel like this? Is something wrong with me? Should I be able to handle this better? These questions do not calm the experience. They complicate it. Because now the person is not just dealing with solitude. They are dealing with their reaction to solitude. And reactions to reactions tend to spiral. A small discomfort becomes a problem. A problem becomes something to solve. A lack of solution becomes frustration. And frustration increases the original discomfort. Now the experience feels heavier than it actually is. Not because solitude is intense. But because it has been layered with interpretation. And interpretation always adds weight. Now the brain updates again. This is not just uncomfortable. This is something I struggle with. And once something is framed as a struggle, it becomes something to avoid more strongly. Now the shift is almost complete. Solitude is no longer just something that feels different. It is something that feels difficult. And difficulty, especially when repeated, becomes something the brain labels as undesirable. Now all that remains is time. Time for this pattern to repeat. Time for avoidance to strengthen. Time for expectation to solidify. And slowly, without any single moment marking the change, something that began as neutrality has turned into something else. Something the brain approaches carefully. Something it prefers to minimize. Something that feels heavier than it should. And that is the quiet foundation of fear. Not loud. Not obvious. But persistent. And once something becomes persistent, it tends to stay. Now, the pattern no longer needs reinforcement. It runs on its own. No one has to teach it. No one has to explain it. It simply continues. A person avoids being alone. They feel better around others. They return to presence whenever possible. And each time this happens, the pattern strengthens. Not dramatically. Not noticeably. Just enough. And just enough, repeated often, becomes permanent. Now something interesting begins to happen. Solitude starts shrinking. Not physically, but in how much of it a person can tolerate. Where once someone might sit alone for long periods without noticing, now even short moments feel longer than they are. Time stretches. Not because it has changed, but because attention has nowhere to go but inward. And inward attention slows perception. A few minutes feel extended. A quiet pause feels noticeable. A gap in activity feels like something that needs to be filled. So it gets filled. Again and again. With small actions. Small distractions. Small movements. Not because they are necessary, but because they restore a sense of normal. Now imagine this repeated across a lifetime. A person rarely experiences uninterrupted solitude. When they do, it is brief. Interrupted quickly. Managed automatically. So the brain never fully learns that solitude is manageable. It never builds tolerance. And without tolerance, even neutral experiences feel stronger than they are. Now something else begins to take shape. Dependence. Not on people in a dramatic way, but on presence. The presence of something outside the self. Voices. Movement. Shared attention. Anything that keeps the mind from turning fully inward. Because inward, by now, feels unpredictable. And unpredictability feels uncomfortable. So the brain learns to rely on external input. Not consciously. Just consistently. And reliance, when repeated often enough, becomes expectation. Now the absence of external input feels like something is missing. Not something specific. Just, something. And that feeling is difficult to ignore. Because the brain is very sensitive to absence. It notices when something expected is not there. And it tries to restore it. Now solitude is no longer just quiet. It is a noticeable absence of expected stimulation. And that absence becomes the focus. Why is it so quiet? Why does this feel empty? What should be happening right now? These questions do not resolve the experience. They intensify it. Because they keep attention fixed on the absence itself. Now something subtle turns into something stronger. Humans begin associating solitude with lack. Not just lack of people, but lack of engagement. Lack of structure. Lack of clarity. And lack, when repeated often enough, begins to feel like loss. Not actual loss, but perceived loss. Something that should be there, but isn't. And perceived loss always carries emotional weight. Even if nothing has actually been taken away. Now the experience of being alone is no longer neutral. It carries a quiet sense of something missing. And that feeling, even if mild, is enough to guide behavior. Because humans move toward fullness. And away from emptiness. Even when emptiness is not harmful. Now something important locks in. Solitude becomes something to fix. The brain stops exploring it. It stops adapting to it. It simply avoids it. Now the loop is complete. Solitude feels unfamiliar. Unfamiliar feels uncomfortable. Uncomfortable is avoided. Avoidance prevents familiarity. And the cycle continues. Now imagine someone encountering extended solitude for the first time after long avoidance. No immediate distractions. No quick escape. No easy way to fill the space. The experience feels intense. Not because solitude has changed, but because the person has not practiced it. Their tolerance is low. Their expectations are negative. Their attention is fixed inward. Everything amplifies at once. Thoughts feel louder. Time feels slower. Discomfort feels stronger. And this creates a powerful impression. Being alone is difficult. Even if that difficulty is temporary. Even if it would settle with time. The brain does not wait to find out. It reacts. And the reaction reinforces the belief. This is something to avoid. Now something subtle becomes something clear. Fear. Not loud fear. Not panic. But a steady reluctance. A preference so strong that it shapes behavior automatically. A quiet resistance to entering a state that feels unpredictable, effortful, and empty. And because this fear is not dramatic, it often goes unnoticed. People do not say, "I am afraid of being alone." They say, "I just don't like it. I feel better with others. I need something to do." Simple statements. But behind them is a long chain of learned associations. Now something else happens. This pattern becomes invisible. It blends into normal behavior. Constant activity feels normal. Constant connection feels normal. Constant engagement feels normal. And anything outside that feels off. Solitude is no longer just uncommon. It feels unnatural. Even though it once was not. And that is how the process completes itself. Not with a clear ending. Not with a final shift. But with a quiet settling. A state where most humans live slightly away from themselves. Just enough to avoid discomfort. Just enough to maintain stability. Just enough to never fully notice the pattern. And that is where fear becomes permanent. Not because it is strong. But because it is consistent. And consistency, more than intensity, is what makes something last. At this moment nothing about this feels unusual. That is the most important part. The pattern has become normal. People fill their time. They seek connection. They avoid extended silence. Not because they are instructed to. But because it feels natural. And when something feels natural, it stops being questioned. This is where the process becomes self-sustaining. Solitude is not examined. It is simply reduced. And reduction, repeated often enough, becomes absence. Now something interesting happens. Humans begin losing reference points. Not for the world. But for themselves. Because when you are rarely alone, you rarely experience yourself without interruption. Your thoughts are shaped by conversation. Your attention is guided by others. Your behavior is adjusted through interaction. You are always responding. But rarely just existing. And when existence without response becomes unfamiliar, it begins to feel unnatural. Not wrong. But strange enough to avoid. Now imagine sitting alone again. No one nearby. No immediate task. No external demand. Just time. The mind activates, as always. But now something else appears almost immediately. Discomfort with the lack of direction. What should I be doing? Why am I just sitting here? This feels unproductive. This is new. Earlier, solitude was uncomfortable because of internal noise. Now, it is uncomfortable because of perceived inactivity. And humans, over time, have learned to associate value with action. Doing something feels right. Doing nothing feels questionable. Even when doing nothing is not harmful. So solitude begins to carry another layer. Not just internal activity. Not just uncertainty. But a sense of wasted time. And that feeling creates pressure. Not urgent pressure. But enough to prompt action. Find something to do. Fill the space. Restore movement. And again, the pattern reinforces itself. Now, something subtle becomes stronger. Humans begin fearing not just the experience of being alone, but what it represents. Because solitude, at this point, is no longer just a state. It becomes a mirror. And mirrors, when looked into for too long, reveal things that are easy to ignore in motion. Unfinished thoughts. Unresolved questions. Unclear directions. Things that do not appear when attention is constantly outward. So being alone begins to feel like exposure. Not to danger, but to reality. Your own. And reality, when unfiltered, is not always comfortable. Not because it is negative, but because it is unstructured. Now something important shifts. Humans begin avoiding solitude not just for comfort, but for stability. Because being alone introduces variability. Thoughts can go anywhere. Feelings can shift unpredictably. Time can stretch in uncomfortable ways. And stability, once valued, becomes something to protect. So solitude becomes something that disrupts that stability. And anything that disrupts stability is approached cautiously. Now, something else quietly develops. Substitution. Humans begin replacing true solitude with controlled forms of aloneness. Being alone. But not fully alone. With sound. With activity. With something external present at all times. Because complete silence. Complete stillness. Complete isolation. Feels too open. Too undefined. Too revealing. So they create environments where they are technically alone. But never fully disconnected. And this reduces discomfort. Which reinforces the behavior. Now, something subtle but powerful has happened. Humans no longer practice true solitude. They simulate connection even in isolation. Which means their tolerance for actual solitude decreases even further. Now, if true solitude appears, it feels intense. Not because it is overwhelming, but because it is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar experiences, once again, feel larger than they are. Now the pattern is complete. Solitude leads to discomfort. Discomfort leads to avoidance. Avoidance reduces familiarity. Reduced familiarity increases discomfort. And the loop continues indefinitely. Now something important becomes clear. Fear of being alone is not built on a single cause. It is built on layers. Survival patterns. Social behavior. Internal awareness. Loss of structure. Loss of control. Perceived absence. Lack of familiarity. Each layer adds weight. None of them alone create fear. But together, they create a state the brain prefers to avoid. And avoidance, over time, becomes fear. Not because the state is dangerous, but because it feels difficult to handle. Now imagine this carried into every part of life. People surround themselves with constant input. Constant activity. Constant connection. Not always meaningful, but always present. Because presence keeps the internal world quieter. And quiet internal worlds feel easier to live in. Now remove that presence again. True solitude. The full weight of everything returns at once. Internal activity. Unstructured time. Lack of feedback. Perceived absence. And without practice handling it, it feels overwhelming. Even if it would settle with time. But the brain does not wait for that. It reacts quickly. This is uncomfortable. And once labeled as uncomfortable, the response is immediate. Avoid. And that is how something very quiet becomes very powerful. Not through intensity, but through repetition. Now, at this point, something interesting remains. Despite everything, solitude has not changed. It is still the same condition it always was. Quiet. Still. Open. What has changed is the human response to it. And that response, built over time, now feels natural. Even though it was learned. And anything learned can feel permanent. If it is repeated long enough. That is where we are now. Humans, surrounded by constant presence. Constant input. Constant engagement. Living slightly away from themselves. Not because they have to. But because it feels easier. And anything that feels easier is repeated until it becomes normal. And once it becomes normal, it becomes very difficult to question or change. Now the environment changes. Not slowly. Not quietly. But all at once. Humans do not just live in groups anymore. They live in constant connection. Not occasional presence. Not shared physical space alone. But continuous access to others. At any moment. Voices, messages, movement, information. Always available. And availability changes everything. Because when something is always accessible, the brain stops preparing for its absence. Earlier, humans moved between states. Together. Alone. Together again. There was rhythm. Now the rhythm collapses. Because connection no longer requires effort. It no longer requires proximity. It only requires intention. And intention is easy. So the brain adjusts. Connection becomes the default. Not something you seek. Something you expect. Now imagine what happens when the default disappears. Even briefly. No notifications. No voices. No interaction. The absence is immediate. Not gradual. Because the brain has not been practicing that absence. It has been avoiding it. Now something subtle becomes amplified. Silence feels louder. Not physically. But perceptually. Because it contrasts sharply with constant input. The brain, used to processing streams of information, suddenly has nothing to process. So it turns inward. Immediately. And without warning. Now everything that was previously background becomes foreground. Thoughts. Sensations. Internal dialogue. All of it rises. Not because it increased. But because there is nothing else competing with it. And competition matters. Because attention always goes somewhere. If it cannot go outward, it goes inward. Now imagine someone who rarely experiences this. Who moves from one input to another. One interaction to another. One piece of information to the next. Their mind is constantly occupied. Not necessarily overwhelmed. Just, filled. Now remove all of that. Instantly. The contrast is intense. Not dangerous. But unfamiliar enough to feel uncomfortable. And unfamiliar discomfort, once again, is interpreted as something to fix. So what happens? The person restores input. Quickly. Without thinking. A sound. A message. A task. Anything to bring the environment back to baseline. And the moment they do, the discomfort disappears. Which teaches the brain something very important. Silence is the problem. Input is the solution. Now repeat this enough times. And the association becomes automatic. Now something else develops. Humans begin fearing gaps. Not large gaps. Small ones. Moments between tasks. Pauses in conversation. Seconds of stillness. These used to go unnoticed. Now they are filled immediately. Because the brain has learned that gaps lead to discomfort. And discomfort should be avoided. Now something deeper changes. Attention span shifts. Not dramatically at first. Just slightly. The brain becomes used to quick transitions from one thing to another, without long periods of sustained stillness. Which means when stillness does occur, it feels longer than it is. Because the brain is not used to it. Now time itself begins to feel different. Short moments stretch. Quiet periods expand. Not because time changed, but because the brain is no longer calibrated for stillness. And recalibration requires exposure. But exposure is being avoided. So the brain stays miscalibrated. Now solitude is not just unfamiliar. It is misinterpreted. Silence feels longer. Stillness feels heavier. Internal activity feels stronger. And all of this reinforces the same conclusion. This state is uncomfortable. Now something subtle becomes powerful. Humans begin carrying connection with them everywhere. Not physically, but mentally. Even when alone, they are not fully alone. Because they are connected to something external. Constantly. And this prevents full exposure to solitude. Which prevents adaptation. Which keeps discomfort alive. Now something important happens. True solitude becomes rare. Not because it cannot exist, but because it is consistently avoided. And rarity increases intensity. Anything rarely experienced feels stronger when it appears. So now, when someone finally encounters real solitude, it feels overwhelming. Not because it is overwhelming, but because it is unfamiliar, unpracticed, and uninterrupted. All at once. Now the brain reacts strongly. This is too much. Even if it is not. And that reaction strengthens the avoidance further. Now we reach a point where something has fully reversed. Originally, solitude was the default. Connection was the variation. Now connection is the default. Solitude is the variation. And anything outside the default feels wrong. Even if it is not. Now something else emerges. People begin fearing disconnection itself. Not just being alone. But being unreachable. Unavailable. Cut off from input. Because disconnection removes control over access to others. And lack of control, again, feels like risk. So connection is maintained constantly. Even when unnecessary. Even when exhausting. Because it prevents the discomfort of absence. Now something final settles in. Humans are no longer avoiding solitude itself. They are avoiding the return to themselves. Because without external input, without distraction, without constant engagement, there is only one place attention can go. Inward. And inward, after everything that has been built, feels unfamiliar, unstructured, and difficult to manage. So they stay outward. Not consciously, but consistently. And consistency makes it permanent. Now solitude is no longer just something people dislike. It is something they rarely experience fully. Which means it never has a chance to feel normal again. And anything that never feels normal will always feel slightly uncomfortable. And anything that feels consistently uncomfortable becomes something the brain prefers to avoid. That is how the modern world completes the process. Not by creating fear from nothing, but by amplifying every small piece of it. Until avoidance feels natural. And presence feels necessary. And yet, something doesn't fully disappear. Despite everything. Despite the avoidance, the constant input, the shrinking tolerance. There are moments. Small ones. Where something different appears. A pause that doesn't feel uncomfortable. A quiet that doesn't feel empty. A moment alone that doesn't immediately demand escape. These moments are easy to miss. Because they are not dramatic. They don't announce themselves. They just exist. And when they do, they feel different. Not exciting. Not intense, but stable. This is important, because it reveals something that has been hidden under all the layers. Solitude itself never became the problem. Only the relationship to it changed. Now imagine someone staying in that moment just a little longer. Not forcing anything. Not trying to fix anything. Just remaining. At first, the usual patterns appear. Thoughts. Restlessness. A subtle urge to move, to reach for something, to break the stillness. But instead of acting on that urge, they wait. And something interesting happens. The intensity begins to shift. Not disappear instantly, but soften. Because attention, when not constantly redirected, begins to settle on its own. The mind, when not interrupted, starts organizing itself. Thoughts that felt loud begin to space out. Noise becomes pattern. Pattern becomes quieter. This is what was always happening underneath. It was just never given enough time to complete. Now imagine this repeated. Not perfectly. Not consistently. But often enough. Moments of solitude that are not immediately interrupted. Moments of stillness that are allowed to exist. Slowly. Very slowly. Familiarity begins to return. And familiarity changes everything. Because what is familiar no longer feels threatening. Now the same conditions that once felt uncomfortable begin to feel manageable. Then neutral. And sometimes even comfortable. Not because they changed, but because the brain adapted. The same way it always does. Through exposure. Now something deeper begins to shift. Control is no longer the focus. Because in solitude, control was never the solution. The attempt to control thoughts, feelings, or internal movement was what created tension. So when control relaxes, the experience becomes lighter. Not perfectly calm, but less resistant. And less resistance means less friction. Now solitude is no longer something to manage. It is something to allow. And allowance requires less effort than control. Now something else appears. Clarity. Not constant clarity. Not dramatic insight. Just small moments where thoughts align more easily. Where things make sense without being forced. This was always there. But it was hidden beneath constant interruption. Now, without that interruption, it surfaces. Naturally. And that creates a different association. Solitude is not just a place of discomfort. It is also a place where things become clearer. Where the mind settles. Where attention is not pulled in every direction at once. Now something important begins to reverse. The same loop that created avoidance begins to weaken. Solitude is experienced. Experience builds familiarity. Familiarity reduces discomfort. Reduced discomfort lowers avoidance. And slowly, the cycle shifts. Not completely, but enough. Now something else becomes possible. Choice. Instead of automatically avoiding solitude, a person can remain in it. Not always. Not perfectly. But intentionally. And intention changes behavior. Now solitude is no longer something that controls reaction. It becomes something that can be entered. Or left. Without the same level of resistance. Now something subtle but powerful appears. Comfort with self-presence. Not in a dramatic sense. Just the ability to exist without needing constant external input. And that ability changes everything. Because once you can remain with yourself, you are no longer dependent on constant distraction. You are no longer avoiding internal space. You are no longer reacting automatically to silence. Now silence becomes just another state. Not something special. Not something threatening. Just quiet. Now something important becomes clear. Fear of being alone was never fixed. It was learned. And because it was learned, it can be unlearned. Not instantly. Not completely. But gradually. Through the same process that created it. Repetition. Familiarity. Exposure. Now something remains. Even after all of this. Variation. Some people will always prefer more connection. Some will prefer more solitude. That balance never disappears. Because humans are not meant to be identical. But the fear. The automatic avoidance. The discomfort that feels overwhelming. That part is not permanent. It is just practiced. And anything practiced can be practiced differently. Now, at this point, we arrive somewhere quiet. Not empty. Not uncomfortable. Just, still. And in that stillness, something becomes obvious. Solitude was never the problem. The distance from it was. And once that distance closes, even slightly, everything begins to feel different. Not because the world changed, but because the way it is experienced did. And that is where the story turns. Not into fear, but into something else. Something quieter. Something steadier. Something that was always there. Waiting underneath all the noise. After all the layers. The habits. The avoidance. The noise. There is no final discovery waiting. Only a return. Because solitude was never something humans needed to build. It was something they moved away from. And anything you move away from long enough feels unfamiliar when you come back. So the final shift is not about learning something new. It's about noticing what never left. Now imagine sitting alone again. Not as an experiment. Not as a challenge. Not as something to fix. Just, sitting. At first, everything you expect is still there. The thoughts. The subtle restlessness. The instinct to reach for something. All the patterns built over time. They don't disappear just because you understand them. Understanding does not erase habit. Only repetition does that. So nothing magical happens at the beginning. And that's important. Because expecting something magical is just another way of resisting what is already there. So instead, nothing is expected. Time passes. Slowly at first. Then less noticeably. Thoughts move. Some stay. Some leave. Without interruption. Without being pushed away. Without being held onto. They begin to settle. Not into silence. But into something softer. Less demanding. Less urgent. Now something subtle changes. Attention stops searching for something to fix. It stops asking, what should I be doing? Because nothing needs to be done. And when nothing needs to be done, the pressure disappears. Now the experience shifts again. Not dramatically. Just enough. Solitude no longer feels like an empty space that needs filling. It feels like a space that already exists. Without requiring anything from you. Now something else becomes clear. All the discomfort that once seemed tied to being alone was never coming from the silence itself. It was coming from resistance to it. From trying to change it. Avoid it. Escape it. And when that resistance fades, even slightly, the discomfort fades with it. Not completely. But enough to notice the difference. Now something deeper appears. A kind of stability that doesn't depend on anything external. Not on people. Not on noise. Not on constant activity. Just, presence. And presence is quiet. Not empty. But steady. Now think back. To the very beginning. When humans lived in a world where solitude was normal. Not meaningful. Not threatening. Just part of being alive. They didn't think about it. They didn't analyze it. They didn't try to fix it. They simply existed within it. And over time. Through survival, through society, through habit. That simplicity was layered over. Until being alone felt like something else entirely. But those layers were added. Which means they can thin. Not disappear completely. But become lighter. Less dominant. Now something important settles in. You don't need to remove the noise. You don't need to reject connection. You don't need to change the world around you. You only need to notice the space underneath it. Because it's already there. Always has been. Even in the middle of everything. Even when surrounded by people. Even when constantly engaged. There is always a point where attention can rest. Not outward. But inward. And not in a heavy, overwhelming way. Just, lightly. Now solitude is no longer a place you are forced into. It becomes something you can return to. Not permanently. Not completely. But whenever you choose. And that choice changes the entire experience. Because what is chosen rarely feels like a threat. Now the fear has nowhere to attach. Not because solitude became safe. But because it was never unsafe. Only unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things lose their edge when you stop avoiding them. So in the end, nothing dramatic happens. No sudden transformation. No permanent state of calm. Just a gradual shift. From resistance. To allowance. From avoidance. To familiarity. From noise. To something quieter underneath. And once that shift begins, even slightly, being alone stops feeling like something you need to escape. And starts feeling like something you can simply be in. Without urgency. Without pressure. Without explanation. Just, there. And that is where the story ends. Not with an answer. But with the absence of a problem that once felt very real. A problem built slowly. And just as slowly. Let go. Because even when the fear softens, life doesn't suddenly become silent. The world is still loud. Still fast. Still full of things asking for your attention. And you still move through it. You still talk. Still respond. Still engage. Nothing about that disappears. But something underneath it changes. Before, silence felt like something missing. Now, noise starts to feel like something added. Not bad. Not overwhelming. Just, extra. And when something is extra, you don't depend on it the same way. Now imagine moving through your day. People around you. Conversations happening. Things to do. And in the middle of all of that, there are small gaps. Tiny ones. A pause between words. A moment before responding. A second where nothing is required. Before, those gaps were invisible. Or quickly filled. Now, they are noticeable. Not in a distracting way. Just, present. And inside those gaps, there is no pressure. No need to perform. No need to respond. No need to become anything. Just a brief return to yourself. This is where something new stabilizes. Not dramatic solitude. Not extended isolation. But micro moments of being alone. Even while surrounded by others. And those moments are enough. Because they keep the connection to yourself active. So you don't drift too far outward. You don't lose that quiet center. Now something interesting happens. Being with others changes too. Because you are no longer using people to escape yourself. You are with them. Without needing them to fill something. And that makes connection lighter. Less pressured. Less dependent. You listen more easily. You speak without forcing. You don't rush to fill every silence. Because silence is no longer a problem. It's just part of the rhythm. Now something else fades. The urgency. That constant need to move from one thing to another. To keep attention occupied at all times. It doesn't disappear completely. But it loosens. And when urgency loosens, time feels different. Not slower in a dramatic way. But less compressed. Less crowded. Moments feel like they have space again. And space changes perception. Because in space, you notice things you used to miss. Not because you are trying to. But because there is room to. Now something very subtle becomes clear. You were never afraid of being alone. You were afraid of what happened when everything else stopped. And now that stopping no longer feels threatening. There is nothing left to avoid. So solitude becomes optional. Not something forced. Not something resisted. Just something that exists when it exists. And disappears when it doesn't. No meaning attached. No weight added. Just another state. Like being awake. Like being tired. Like being in a crowd. Now imagine the original human again. Standing alone. No noise. No constant input. No expectation of distraction. Just existence. That state never disappeared. It only became covered. Layered. And now, without needing to remove every layer, you can still access it. Not fully. Not permanently. But enough. Enough to recognize it. Enough to return to it. And that is all that was ever needed. Because once something is recognized, it stops feeling distant. And once it stops feeling distant, it stops feeling unfamiliar. And once it stops feeling unfamiliar, it stops feeling like something to fear. So nothing is solved. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is completed. Only something is understood. Quietly. Without effort. That being alone was never the opposite of being okay. It was just another way of being. And once that becomes obvious, even briefly, you stop running from it. And without running, there is nowhere else you need to go. That's it. No conclusion. No final message. Just a quiet end. To something that was never really a problem in the first place.